Hello, hello. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to join today. We're really excited to have you here. For those of you that are not familiar with this series, I'll give you a brief rundown. So, we have a new episode every month where we're talking about different aspects of CICD. So, we hope you enjoy today's session and continue to join us in the future. Just a reminder, so this is interactive, so feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to actually answer them live if possible. Today's episode is about coexisting between Kubernetes and your legacy tech, whatever that might be. And in some cases, the lines between Kubernetes and modern tech is a little bit blurry too. Joining me today is a good friend of mine, Mark Panthofer. When Mark isn't writing technical books, he's a VP of DevOps at Nvisia, focusing on using cloud native DevOps to improve business results. His team supports the enterprise adoption of cloud native DevOps capabilities driven by platform engineering. So he's truly an expert on how to coexist between modern and legacy tech. And he has some pretty crucial insights on resource allocation, best practices, and strategies. You can maximize your efforts. Without further ado, Mark, are you ready to get started?
I believe I am, if you can see me.
Yep,
I don't
we
see
can see you and hear
myself,
you.
so I assume we're okay. All right.
We are all good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mark.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm excited to talk about the topic. I mean, it's, a place I spend a lot of time, and you and I over the years have had some great conversations. And so looking forward to sharing some of that today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's just jump right in then. So, I guess the first question is, this is a broad topic. I mean, I think it's pretty apparent that it's a broad topic and it has a lot of impact on a lot of different people and organizations. So, the first thing would be to attempt to actually define what it actually means to coexist between legacy technologies and Kubernetes or modern technologies. In your mind, what does that look like?
Well, yeah, I guess the first part of that, at least in my experience, means that you're in the process of some kind of modernization, right? So you've got old and new stuff going on. And given that sort of scene, chances are technology is not your biggest problem, right? So you're sort of dealing again with old product, old user base, old, a lot of things that have, worked for years. And so, again, it means you're supporting sort of two worlds. And that is, in terms of, again, technology and culture. Um, it also means that you need to start to think about how to coordinate and bring those worlds together. It's oftentimes trickier than you think, right? You can't just leap ahead with the capabilities of sort of that new world um, without considering the ramifications of the old, blue, green, or canary deployment. With some of the older technology, they would look at you probably a little strangely if you were to say that. Yeah, so those are some things, but I think, generally, the coexistence, we look at that, we see it in very small shops, very large shops as well. The, your strategies, and I think we'll maybe get into a little bit of that later here and later in the talk, or in our conversation. But the almost all of the organizations that are in this scenario didn't do so by choice, right? So
Right.
they ended up in a world where they kind of went to bed one night and maybe they were a financial services company or a manufacturing company. They woke up the next morning and they're a software company. And by that, I mean, of course, their current, how they provide their services or their products or manufacturing are important, but to maintain their market share, the things they wrap that user experience around those services or products becomes very involved with software and the ability to compete in the market. You could have the greatest thing, but if you don't have the right tech sort of around it from a software perspective, people may not go unnoticed or go out of business. So yeah, so that's what I see when I think about that kind of coexistence. That's kind of my view of the world from where I'm sitting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important. We've actually heard this before on this series, which is, every company is a technology company nowadays, because that's your competitive edge for the most part, right? I mean, obviously, you can
Mhm.
iterate on product, you can change, your mechanism to deliver to customers, all that stuff. But on the back end, it's all hinging on technology. And I think to your point, it's a forced situation in a lot of cases. Like you might have some enterprising shops that are like, no, we're going to try to get ahead of it, right? But a lot of times it's like realizing that you're behind and now you have to play catch up, and it kind of forces this coexistence process.
Yeah, and it's really difficult because the people that sort of got these organizations there have been around quite some time,
Yeah.
and they play a really key role. And they've been really loyal to the company. And the question is, do they want to evolve, right, with the company that and the organization to kind of the newer ways that are going to be more important as they go forward? Honestly, that's some of the more difficult part of our job. Again, we can make the technology work. We can make we can create, we can bridge those things. You can be creative in how you go about doing it. But really, people making hard decisions about, well, this has been my path for the last 25 years. Do I
Right.
really want to take the time it takes to learn all this new stuff? Is
Yeah.
a real thing.
And there's definitely some fear there for sure.
There is.
Of kind of
But
the
But on the other hand, I should be the poster child that if even old people can do this, right? So big old white beard here, you know. So I try to give people confidence, right?
yeah, bringing the gray beard into modern
Mhm.
DevOps, right?
There you go.
Perfect. Well, we did drop a poll, so Sharon, let's go ahead and close out those results and just see. We were just asking, how many of you out there feel like you're actually coexisting between legacy and modern tech? And it is overwhelmingly yes, with 82% of the people responding that they are coexisting. And this is honestly, it's not surprising, but it's kind of the expectation. We do occasionally work with some folks who are like, no, we're spending the next 3 months changing everything over. Everything's getting modernized, all the CICD, the whole nine yards. But that's pretty unusual. For the most part, you have legacy stuff that kicks around. Does this align with your expectations, Mark, as well?
Well, yeah, first of all, congratulations, you're on the right program, right? So if you don't have any legacy stuff around, this may not be all that interesting. Yes, it does. And again, I think maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I think kind of how things flow here. Yeah, it lines up, particularly any sort of larger shop. Nobody got there overnight. Very few are cloud native that we end up we're dealing with. There's certainly some out there, right? But yeah, so I think that's pretty much my expectation.
Yeah, it definitely lines up. And I guess, while we're at it, so, if you had just like 30 seconds to describe, what you think some legacy sort of CI/CD processes look like, can you just throw some things out there that you see on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, but real quick, just on the other thing about people, there's 18% of the poll that said no, right? Guess what? What you're writing today is already legacy. So I'm just going to throw that at you real quick. So anyone who said 18%, look real closely at the stuff you have. It's tomorrow's legacy code. Yeah. So in terms of defining that, I have a hard time doing anything in 30 seconds, Brandon, as you know, but I will do my darndest. Yeah. So I think, fundamentally, when I look at it, when you start at what legacy can be, I mean, it can be. I joked around with you in the past. Pushing code from Bob's workstation into production, dropping some code onto an IIS server, and there you have it. And that's not ideal, as we of course have come to know it. More likely, a lot of the organizations that I can consider sort of the legacy CI, if they've at least understand CI, they've moved to at least Git. Thank you very much. We have had clients where we have to teach them Git. They're coming from some other environment.
Yeah.
And some of the nuances within Git, which are extremely powerful, are also, you need to understand them. But anyway, so looking at that, so many of them really are more monolithic applications. They are following sort of release branching versus trunk based. That's pretty thing. And from there, of course, they have sort of the sketchy process where they go from the releases and cherry pick stuff back into their developer main sort of trunk. And so that's one thing. So, but when you start to move into and I'll talk one more second about that, the kind of the differences. But as you move toward my microservice architectures, and when I say that, I just want to be really clear. I'm not talking about some textbook definition of microservices.
Right.
I'm saying splitting up your monoliths into following very, usually domain style patterns, and breaking things down that way. So you're not talking about, getting down to serverless kind of granularity. I'm talking about a practical decomposition, really, in many cases of those. But the other part is infrastructure as code. So the first thing,
Right.
so we're not just dealing with software that comprises our applications. A lot of my world is spent in working with infrastructure as code. So when we apply that, we don't want that coming out of release branches. We want to know, hey, what's really running in this environment? That's super helpful. And I've been on a lot of calls where we've had to do a lot of detective work. If you have good labeling, you can usually get through that. But yeah, so usually an old CI process is very focused. The pipeline looks very much like the application that's being built, very
Yeah.
much like you were just running it from your desktop and scripting it fundamentally, right? So you have some sort of build process, some kind of unit testing going on, and they're all language specific, right? So you might like have Maven and Gradle for Java apps, .NET build or NG for Angular kind of thing, right? And you may or may not take the artifacts that you generate and push them to a remote registry of some kind, npm or NuGet. Again, it would have specific to the application type. The real, that's kind of the way you see those. And by the way, it's funny because almost every application hand rolls a lot of additional dependencies into their pipeline.
Hidden dependencies a lot of times.
Well, okay, yeah, and then you're going to take me into the Jenkins templating hell, and so, and you see where people got like really clever and creative to the point where no one knows what's going on in a pipeline.
Right.
There's templates that are activated by particular conditions or the existence of things, and to be able to do that, sort of look at it and understand what's going to happen, um, you don't know. Yeah, so that's another part. But the modern pipelines are super straightforward, right? It is Docker build, Docker push, right? And so one thing, and what that means is all of that custom application things, whether for my Angular, Java, .NET, whatever, .NET Core app, hopefully .NET Core, um, it's in a Docker file, right? So that's also in source code control. And so, so that all that build and even the unit testing occurs inside of that Docker file. So that's sort of important. So some key differences, right? So the first thing is Docker's your friend. From a guy who wrote a book on some aspect of Docker, you'd expect no, nonetheless. But it's probably worth taking a few days to actually learn it. I'm just going to put that out there, rather than just kind of hacking away at it. It becomes an really important tool in your toolbox. Also, it helps streamline across languages, right? So not just across languages, so that all my pipelines look similar, whether it's again a Python app or a .NET app. It's going to again Docker build, Docker push, and then we'll get in, talk in a second about the release. But it also gives me immutability in those images across dev, staging, tests. So I'm injecting the environment bits into those, right? So
Right.
that's super important. And I think, Brandon, a lot of times when we start talking about cool stuff with CICD, we forget what people and go through every day to kind of get there, to prepare that environment. And just one last distinction. So if I'm kind of looking at the old way people think of CI, particularly in the CI side of things, for me, CI doesn't end until that build is running in your dev or integration or QA cluster.
Absolutely.
So because
yeah.
So that's not if you look at a lot of the formal definitions of CI, it's like, hey, I pushed my code, it merged, it ran unit tests, and therefore, and everything from there is like a very specific release based on some, sort of event.
Right.
And so, we look at that very much more in the modern world. And that's why I think you saying that, well, kind of duh, right? But when I'm done with my merge, it's running in an environment. And if you also should have some sort of smoke test or other drivers in that environment to execute some things to make sure that, at least from a regression and integration standpoint, that it's working. But anyway, yeah, so that's kind of the big differences. That kind of makes sense with what you were thinking, or did I answer?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, 30 seconds plus or minus 5 minutes, but yeah, we're here, Mark.
Dude, Pretty good
Um,
for me. I'll try to get
y
that down to 4.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, that's great, and I mean, that hits on a lot of really good points. So, I think we actually have a poll lined up for containers, and you were talking a lot about the container process that we take for granted. Sharon, let's go ahead and drop that container poll. I'm curious to see where people are at. The other thing that I wanna really drill down on is you had mentioned kind of as a sub-comment to something else, like, hopefully you're on .NET Core, and that kinda leads me to the question, we're talking about coexisting between these legacy and modern processes. Are there applications that really just should not be converted over and just kinda have to remain as legacy? And, like, what are the indicators to you that that has to be the case?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So there's there's a lot of ways to approach that, right? So some I think the kindest way I can say it, if you have a crappy application and you lift and shift it, it's still a crappy application. So
Yeah.
don't, yeah, don't kid yourself about that, right? So, but at the same time, when you start looking at, um, various strategies, you really need to decide up front if some of those things are going to sort of stay behind. So you take a look at a couple things, right? So how often does the code change with a particular entity, right? And even if the code doesn't change a lot, how easy is it to containerize? Because that really becomes a really important decision when you start talking about modern cloud native sort of environments for CICD, et cetera. And if the application is written in an okay way, which quite sadly most monoliths are not at all.
Yeah.
And again, no, and the funny part is you can't have the people that have been working with it for years sort of judge that real well. You need to you need to get a little bit more objective, right? And by that, really trying to containerize it, for instance. Just try to do it, get it running in a container and see how easy that is or hard that is. So let's say it's, a application that's really easy to containerize, then do it, right? And even if you have to use and delve into Windows containers, I hesitate to say, but they certainly have gotten much, much better.
Have,
Um,
but avoid it if you can.
yeah, I mean, if you've got, well, let me back up one more step, right? If I've got .NET applications and I can convert those framework to core, to how we got to this question, do it. Absolutely do it. Do not underestimate the effort that it may take, particularly for older applications,
Yeah.
and some of the nuances that you'll run in there. And so the other part is, look, if it's a complex mess and it doesn't change much, then you kind of consider about leaving that thing where it is, because anything you invest in that is going to be throwaway.
Right.
And you don't want to. You always want to be super careful about making investments that if you execute them perfectly, um, if you execute it perfectly, no one will notice. If you screw it up, everyone will notice, right? And so, but you really want to make sure that you get some benefit. There's tangible benefit from your release cycles, from stability, reliability, et cetera, of the app running, in that modernized form.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that really provides good insight into it. And I think in addition as well, and maybe it's because historically I come from the software side, but I also think sometimes this is a problem that really should be solved from the application architecture of the software side and maybe not the DevOps side, depending on the application, because it might make more sense um to actually modernize the app itself and split it up and make it, basically go greenfield with it, right? But to Mark's point, if you can't perfectly replace that application without causing issues, it's going to cause you grief internally. So that can be a
Yeah.
problem as well.
Well, and honestly, it can be one of the biggest anti-patterns. The biggest
Right.
anti-pattern is, let's take a year or two and rewrite this application.
Right.
I've seen very few of those result in, so if you're lucky, it fizzles out. If you're not so lucky, it doesn't go, it goes even worse, right? So the idea of, you need to figure out a way, unless you have extraordinary resources, which can be in case of an investment, or your company was purchased and they're going to pivot, then there
Right.
might be some runway. but you get beyond 6 months or so, you are asking for trouble because they're fighting the dogs back, right? They've got requests coming in for new features, and you're saying, "Oh no, we're frozen because we're rewriting this," and so a much more successful pattern tends to be more of sort of a strangler pattern, right? Where you're starting to move things from the old application, carve it out into new. But with
Yeah.
the warning and caveat being you better understand what the new one looks like, right? Because if you just start laying down a mess like you were getting at, right? That architecture from the application side, understanding how you're going to be organizing your services, understanding the underlying technologies. Um, and so that your new stuff is better than the old, right? You don't want to create a
Yeah.
new mess, right? And so you migrate that code, and you have to have a lot of discipline when you're doing that. It's like, hey, look, if you're touching this feature, you can't just change the old code. You have to move it over into the new world and snip it off in the old one, right? So forward things over. So
Yeah.
that tends to be a much more successful pattern in that city.
Sure. Be pragmatic, right? I think that's kind of the important thing is here. Like, look at all the options, whether it's modernizing the DevOps side, the application side, whether it's something a project you already have slated for 2 years from now to rebuild pieces of it and to improve it, then it may not make sense to tackle that right now.
Mhm.
So just being pragmatic, I think, is important here. So Sharon, I think we had really good participation on the poll. So let's close that out and just see what the results look like for the container side. Okay. All right, so how many of your apps are containerized? So we have less than half was the primary answer at 64%, about half at 18%, more than half at 18%. And I think that's pretty, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I would expect because a lot of folks are coming from monolithic applications or bigger applications where they haven't quite moved over to containerization or microservices. And so this is kind of what I would expect to see. And it's really good for this talk as well, for sure.
Sure. Yeah, that's not surprising. Obviously, there's all kinds of data I'd like to collect and sift through from this group, but when I look at that, the less than half, a lot of what we run into is a lot of older Microsoft applications where they where organizations have sort of taken I don't know a step. They maybe you could call it for modernization when they went to more cloud enabled. So in other words, I'm running that inside of an app service in
Yeah.
Azure. And that is, certainly it helps you isolate some of the things around the environment and things like that. But it's again a cloud enabled, not really a cloud native sort of service. And you'll find that out when you start to do like swapping slots as a part of a pipeline and find out I get no feedback when they actually cut over. So how do I know my other code that depends on it can be released anyway? So there are things like that that we will often see. And so I suspect that's of that 64%. There's a chunk of those in there as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we actually had a question come into the chat, and then we just had one come into Q&A. So let's pause and kind of take a look at this. So someone had asked, what does it look like to execute it perfectly, even at a high level, in regards to, coexisting between the legacy and the modern? And in
Yeah.
your mind, what's that perfect world look like?
Well, I said, yeah, I think that quote is from my even if you execute it perfectly, right? So if I were to take an existing .NET application, for instance, and go through and convert it over to a um okay, I'm looking back there. I'm distracting myself a little bit. But yeah, it's a if you went through and did the conversion and got all the functionality moved over perfectly, you haven't added anything new. So in other words, you didn't miss a thing. The business has zero value. It's right where
Yeah,
it left off. So you put all this effort in, and what they see on the other side is, oh, and maybe you did a little bit better, an upgrade at least on the UI and some other things. Let's
sure.
hope.
You dressed it
Um,
up.
yeah. So that's kind of what I was talking about. That execute it perfectly. Um, and yeah, that's kind of it there. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
no,
don't know
I
if
mean
that
that makes
helps.
sense. And from my perspective, um, it's just it goes back to what you're saying, right? I mean, executing it perfectly from the end user side, whether that's external or internal customers or whoever it might be, it just means that nothing has changed in that regard when we're talking about the difference between legacy and modern tech. Now, obviously, you probably have a bunch of modern applications that you're delivering that are delivering new features, and those are awesome, and that's the stuff you want to put in front of customers. But for the rest of the stuff, it should be invisible to them. That's how you know that you're executing it perfectly. I think that rarely happens, but if you can minimize the damage and minimize the efforts from your DevOps folks, from your platform folks, your application folks, that's really the closest that you can get to perfection in my experience. And
Hmm.
that's what you're striving for, right? And it's again finding that pragmatic balance between the time you're spending on just maintaining this thing to keep delivering it, to updating it, to adding new features, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Oh, we had another good question come in from Q&A as well. So this was a really container focused question, which was saying, should you still have the build and test steps inside the Docker file of an application if you're using a Kubernetes native CI tool like Tecton, Argo workflows? Do you have a take on that? Maybe a hot take?
So I was looking for the question, but anyway, so can you still use so containers with the I guess I'm a little confused. So you're containerizing the old application and deploying it into a new environment? I mean, that's not sure I got it exactly.
Yes, I think it was. I just sent you the question, but
Okay.
it's really about specifically whether or not you should include it in the Docker file or if it should be part of like the CI workflow outside of
Oh,
that.
yeah. That's a great question. Um, and people are a little more well. It depends. Some of the CI tooling integrates nicely. In other words, so the test results from inside the container get picked up, right? And
Yeah.
so those are transparent in the pipeline. So it's not like just buried in the container build, right? Part logs from that. So there are some integrations there. But yeah, in terms of getting outside of just standard unit testing, there absolutely should be other things that you put into place that handle that work within your workflows. And so there, as everybody knows, like there's all these multiple levels of testing, right? So, one of them is just kind of the internal mock tests, right? Hitting
Yeah.
your UI or your unit test. And that's what usually happens inside the container. Everything above that, which if you really want to get into a CI/CD, and I mean really continuous deployment, you definitely need to have additional tooling that does things like hitting that new component externally, like an API test, and
Right.
then end-to-end tests. Because if you don't automate that, how in the world are you ever going to how are you going to have the feedback to release it without putting humans in the way? Which, and again, that's the way most people are right now. There's definitely some carbon-based life form oversight there, but as you sort of move on, you may find yourself in a scenario where you want to do that, make it easier and easier. So yeah, I think using some of the additional tools, and again, you can even move again the unit testing outside of that if you want, for sure. But generally, what I see is unit tests happen inside the Docker file, and then people don't do anything else.
Right.
Is bad. So I can start with that answer as being, bad. Oh, by the way, and what's their test coverage for the unit tests?
Mhm.
That's another sad chapter in most books, right? Most organizations struggle with that. Um, anyway, so and you're going to have the same thing if you start to add additional testing. It takes people to maintain those. So if you're really taking advantage of the improvements in the flow of your pipelines, in other words, I can get releases out faster because I've automated more. And so moving people from manual test mode into being good with the tooling around it, that is 1,000% where you should head. And some of the biggest savings we see for organizations moving into the modern CI/CD environments with the tooling that's afforded is their test cycles go down from like 2 weeks of people banging on the system to having one or two people working with the developers around automated tests. And so now they're released, they cut it down to a day or two. I mean, by the way, I don't need the the fleet of people hanging away on the system.
Yeah.
So
And I think that's the big net benefit there. I mean, I agree with everything you said, so I don't really have too much to add there except, yeah, I mean, a lot of people do start with adding into the Docker file, and that's fine. Don't think that's all that you need to do, though. There are a lot of additional things that you want to vet, in whatever your CI workflow tool is. Um, and I mean, just make sure you validate it. And then to Mark's point, when you're talking about release management, there's even more stuff that needs to be vetted as far as like the testing that he mentioned. So your problem is not solved by putting it in the Docker file. It could be the beginning of it, but it's still not really my personal recommendation.
well, it's also what you're going to be doing locally, right? So
Yeah.
every time you're doing your local development cycles, like that inner loop, sometimes referred to, right? You're going to be running those same unit tests.
Yep.
And so there should be no surprise when it hits the pipeline and it executes the same ones, And so just getting people used to that.
Yeah.
Again, another tool, some other tooling that you're going to need to look for is coverage. So if people are cranking new code in and not putting any new tests on, you're really just kind of getting some basic regression potentially. You're not getting any new testing.
For sure. All right, let's try to jump back to coexistence now. So
Mhm.
what typically causes the most problems during a coexistence period? And we know the coexistence is likely to be quite long because there are legacy applications that may never get converted, right? So what do you typically see that really causes the most issues?
Ooh, people for sure. I think I started talking about that before, and so that's and what I mean by that, it's when we talk about legacy, we talk about people that have been doing things a particular way for a period of time, right? So,
Yeah.
so in the coexistence, so again, I think I alluded a little bit to this, but there's sort of the short-term, long-term coexistence models. And either way, there's some things that maybe you should take from kind of the DevOps playbook. And by DevOps, I'm not talking about pipelines. I'm talking about the principles and practices around DevOps. So a lot of times we see like larger organizations are sort of doomed to have long running coexistence.
Yeah.
And that's because, you may have, for instance, a big old content management system. And everything you run, all the applications you build around that are kind of ancillary and depend on it. And they're not ready to make a change to that. And it might be because it serves up, very specific content to 100,000 or 1 million users. And, it's something the business is going to be really, hesitant about changing. And then also getting into that fact of what benefit will I get? If I were to kind of change that. So when you're dealing with that, so one other thing I was going to say, and what the bigger struggle is like small organizations. Small organizations don't have the resources oftentimes to coexist very long. You're running, you've got the two cultures, right? You got to deal with that. You have to transition. You're also dealing with dual environments generally. So you kind of have the old and the new, and you're sort of paying for both for a while. And they certainly can't afford to not release new features at a pretty quick clip.
Be
So
competitive, right?
yeah, or I'll stay alive
Yeah.
in many cases. And again, these are very consistently run into organizations in coexistence that again are realizing more and more every day they're a software company. We have to act like one. We have to modernize. We have to get there, right? That's what drives many organizations on this path. So getting into it, so understanding like, again, that DevOps culture and practice, that talking about establishing flow, understanding and identifying constraints within your release processes, your build and release. So what's hanging us up and really kind of trying to find creative ways to minimize that, to handle it, to deal with it. And experiment with different ways of improving that. Yeah, so that's a key thing. So and it's really funny because you end up with almost SREs operating against legacy sort of systems, right? They're trying to figure out new ways, right, to make them more reliable, to make it easier to release, to really drive that coexistence in a way that it's smooth.
Yeah, and I think the key thing here is, right, it's all It's business need driven, right? Because you talked about these critical applications, like to your point, content management system. It could be the pay system or billing. It's stuff that unfortunately has been around since the origination of the company, basically, because it's essential to doing business. But it's also the most vulnerable and likely the most legacy stuff that really needs conversion. So you're playing this balancing act between like, okay, how do we keep this thing alive, minimize our time spent on it, but without impacting the business in any way because it's critical, right? It's critical to the function of the business. And that's really challenging. And to your point, I think you called out one thing, which was trying to identify, improvements that you can make, trying to identify the places to automate, trying to identify I'm not I mean it is low hanging fruit, but it's not really low hanging fruit because none of these problems are small, but areas of incremental improvement that you can start on, I think is huge. Now whether or not there is always that, I don't know, but you hope, right? Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's also having a different set of eyes looking at it.
Oh,
And
for sure.
you need to come in with it's real, it's difficult sometimes when you're coming in from the newer tech side of things. You don't always appreciate the nuance and complexity and sort of years of work that have gone into that legacy system. And always coming in there with a very, I guess, curious nature, not like judgmental. Because I'll tell you right now, some of the people that run those systems are the most judgmental ones to start with, right? Oh, this crusty old junk, whatever. But the idea is that it's a company asset, and treating it and improving it, and again, it puts it in the pet category a bit more than cattle, right? But it is, there's validity in doing that and propping that up a bit, unless again you have a way of modernizing, containerizing, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, we got an interesting question that came in. So, is it okay to shift left by moving monoliths to containers, or is it critical to modernize the app first? Um,
Ooh, wow, there aren't any easy questions coming in.
yeah.
So yeah, it if you can, um, there if it's possible, if it's reasonable, container first is a great way to go, right? So once I get my workload containerized, then it's easier for me to start splitting it up into multiple containers, and doing things with it is generally the thought. The bigger, as I mentioned earlier, it's not terribly uncommon to run into things that the cost of containerizing the application, because it's very messy, bad dependencies, a huge ugly monolith that's evolved over 15 years, 20 years. I mean, it just happens, and I wish I would say it was exceptional, but lots of organizations have this. The question is, how good of a job did they do in organizing it?
Hmm.
And if they did, particularly around dependencies and breaking things up within that application, you might have a run at containerizing that in a week or two or three. But the problem is when you start getting beyond that, you have to start to tell the business why that makes sense.
Yeah.
And if you tell them, oh, we want to put it in a container so we can rewrite it, they're going to look at you just a little funny. And again, it's much nicer to have all of my stuff. And if I have it containerized, I can immediately move that to a modern CICD environment, even though it's crusty old code potentially. It just makes things a lot easier.
Yeah.
But if you
Makes sense.
can't, then you got to deal with, okay, what do you do with the old one? Do you try to modernize that all with, like I said, like something like app services for an old .NET app, or do you just say, just leave that thing where it is, don't spend a minute, and just start migrating functionality into that kind of your new platform? And the one thing I was going to point out there, it's really sort of an important thing I've learned, I guess, over the years with this kind of problem is you need to understand the target we talked about before. What does my new architecture look like, right? So from the application side of things. And then as I start to pull functionality and move it over to that new environment, the big thing that comes up with is data, because chances are you have a monolithic database, um, or or database server that has multiple databases with cross database joins and fun things
Yeah.
like that going
All
on.
these.
And so it's like, oh, so when do we factor that? And what I've kind of learned time and time again is make sure that your new architecture initially has that kind of a data abstraction layer. It has a way for you to isolate your data code from your actual new microservice code in a way that you can use the crusty old database for now in its current glory, and be positioned to make changes to that database without breaking everything. So you've isolated things. You really, your architecture is skewed toward the ability to modify that database down the road. You will be very happy if you do that. Also, again, if you don't try to change, if you try to modify in a coexistence environment, I have an existing application, old crusty monolith running against this database, and I have the new ones, and there's dependencies across data, and I start to try to pluck things out of there, you are going to have a long road ahead of you.
Yeah.
Once you get it all, once you get things migrated all into the new code base, you understand how all that data is used. And it's much easier to refactor again if you have created that data abstraction layer and come back and do that later. So, yeah, anyway, that's just kind of a something I felt like I had to get off my chest. It's just, well,
No,
what
I
would
mean,
happen? People automatically, it's like, oh, while we're doing this, let's change the database around. I'm like, no, don't right now. Just we're gonna have enough to do just to get the functionality organized, understand how the new stuff interacts with those data stores so that you can essentially refactor that after you get everything off the old one. And you're not going to
yeah.
break any strange things that are going on.
No, it's very reasonable advice. As someone who's gone through a modernization effort where they decided to swap out the database at the same time, don't do that. Don't do that. So very good advice, and I think it leads well into the CI/CD conversation too, because you're going to be looking at applications or pieces of that application to bite off and figure out what to convert over, and you need to look holistically at the whole picture, which includes the database, it includes supporting services, it includes things like queues and other supporting stuff that you might have. You really need to understand the big picture, and I think this is where Mark had talked about earlier that it can be hard. You have sort of the legacy, engineer who's been working on this thing for 20 years, and they might be the most resistant to actually making some of these changes, but they also have the most knowledge and they know where the problems are. So make sure you utilize them, utilize their tribal knowledge, because it can really bite you if you don't. At least in my experience. So,
Yeah,
okay, so
and helping to bring them forward too. Make them,
yeah,
if you can make them part of the new world, like they're not being left behind, and they're um that's really important because as they again, you're not looking them to lead the technical charge into the new environment, but you are looking for them to be consulted and advised. And the more they understand about the new technology and dependencies and operating models, patterns, the more they can contribute, frankly.
yeah, absolutely. And getting those people on board and kind of getting the people process in place is so good, and it's going to get you buy-in, and it's going to hopefully help you not deal with many of the headaches that a lot of folks do when they kind of go, I don't know, I don't want to say like siloed, but it is effectively like you'll have like an innovation team or a siloed off team that will kind of go down this process without considering the external groups and bringing them into the fold. And then it comes back to bite you like tenfold, when you actually try to roll this stuff out.
At least
Um,
tenfold. Yeah.
yeah.
Because those innovation teams rarely have good representation from people that have deep knowledge of the current systems. And so, or deep enough or consideration of some of the limitations and what it's going to take to go from A to B.
Yeah, definitely. Um, we did get a question that came in, and what are the common practices to accelerate the modernization process in a large? And again, we're talking about mostly the CI/CD side here, but if there's any like quick tips that you would have here, I mean, I think we did cover some of it, but um,
Yeah, I think the key part is having people having outside people with experience. Now, whether you're hiring them into the team to have leaders within that group. I know there was one organization I worked with, and the reason things were going well is because Brandon was the dude um, on the other side, that was helping kind of and understood stuff, right? How it's supposed to work. If it had been somebody else from within the organization that had not had experience with that, it would have been a really an insurmountable mess, and that So what you need to do is, I guess the first thing is when you're thinking about approaching it is, I think it was Einstein, right, who said, don't expect the same mind that created the problem to fix it, right? So, and so, or if they're going to create a new solution, they'll create the same problem or something similar. And so the idea is you do need some fresh leadership generally. Now that leadership could just be that, that somebody at the executive level likes the modern ways, is more interested in faster releases, getting things in front of users, shortening feedback loops, all of that great stuff that we love to hear in our CI/CD world. Um, and but at the same time, um, you you really need to push things forward. So,
Yeah.
I was just trying to think. There was one other. Yeah, well, I'll come back to it, I think. But
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that that new set of eyes helps a lot. And even if they're, within the company, but maybe they were on a different team or a different area, but they have an interest in it, if, they're willing to learn,
yeah,
they want to put in the effort and they want to improve things, they
yeah,
can become
and
that person.
and
So,
and I'll throw the C word out there. That's consultants. I mean, be really careful, and I am one, by the way, that you own it. So I work a lot with companies helping the heavy lifting on different things, but this key to their success is the people that that those outside folks work with, that they have an that they can carry the torch, and they also understand why it is things were done a particular way and what the alternatives were. And so it's not just like, oh, this is what company X left us, right? You do not want
right.
to be in that scenario. You want to drive that, but dealing with someone that has the exposure to multiple environments and sees those trade-offs can be pretty valuable. But you you can help them get you going, but they can't run the show.
Yep, yep, that makes sense to me. And again, like it's not that consulting groups aren't bringing a ton of knowledge and they have the experience and that they couldn't own it. And maybe your company is fine paying them forever to do this and that's all fine, but it's still bringing some of that knowledge in internal to your company is really important. And I think that goes just as much as if you decide to have an innovation center that's going to spearhead this, they still have to bring that knowledge to the other team. So I think that problem is pervasive either way. Now, Mark, in your experience, so we know we're going to be in this coexistence for a long time. We know that we're going to have legacy, we're going to have modern tech. Is there any way to bridge the gap or maintain some sort of standardization between the old and the new?
So standardization can be kind of double-edged, right? So one of the things that you don't, and particularly when it comes to like tools and things like that, um, if you kind of limit yourself to what your existing tool providers, vendors, et cetera, you could, I mean, you could end up missing out on a lot, right? So you really sort of, keep understand that sort of everything's on the table, but you absolutely need to look at new ways of doing new things. Do not try to say, "Hey, we've been working with this software vendor for or a tool vendor for 20 years. They now have a CI/CD tool. Let's do that." You really want to take a look at things that really much more aligned with cloud native and 12 factor sort of things, and that may or may not be. Maybe they do have something great. Don't change for the sake of changing, but do understand that your new stuff is different than your old stuff. And there may be ways. Don't throw it, but again, at the same time, don't throw the baby away with the bathwater. If there's something that works, reasonably well, and something might be a little better, but there's a huge learning curve for people. You got to consider that. Were there other standards you were thinking of, Brandon? Or
No, I mean, I think that makes sense. From a tool perspective, that's definitely what I've seen. I know we've worked with a lot of teams, particularly at CodeFresh, that will be working with one section of the company, let's say to start, and they're
Mhm.
looking at bringing on a modern tool set because they have dealt with the struggles of Jenkins or whatever it is on the back end, and they're trying to find something that works more natively, right, with containers or cloud native stuff. And then comes the challenge of like the other parts of the organization who maybe are a bit more stubborn about that, right? And so they're looking at, okay, how can we standardize this? And that's a challenging thing. And I think to your point, You do want to evaluate the tools that are out there because you just don't know what you're leaving on the table. And it's not just because, whatever CodeFresh has these tools, but it's just in general. I've been in that situation before where we did a modernization of microservices, we did a modernization to newer technology, and we tried to keep using our legacy CICD process and kind of shoehorn it into there. And the problem that we had when we did that was microservices just grow exponentially and they quickly outscale your old CI/CD process and your tooling. And unfortunately, that creates pain that is just really bad to deal with. Because particularly when you're trying to have a deploy go off at 3 a.m. or whatever into production and it fails, and one of your instances of your build platform is down and you don't know why, and it has some special dependencies. And so I do think if you don't start to look at the tooling a little bit to at least understand what's out there, you're going to miss a lot of the potential benefits of how you can improve, the entire end-to-end process.
Yeah, and that process in of itself can help you understand better what the world should look like, right?
Yeah.
And again, you do that with caution, but again, let's just put it out there. A lot of the tool vendors do a nice job of saying, "Hey, you could have this. Here's what your world could look like." And again, I like to think most of it's true, but it does at least help you understand a little bit more of the vision that's possible versus just maybe a blog post somebody read.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, they read a Medium blog post, right? I think you've mentioned this before, and they're like, "Now I'm the expert in this. I'm going to deliver."
Yes, yes, yes. We see a lot of let's just say eclectic uh technical combinations where different people read different blog posts. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we got a great question, and it actually leads nicely into our next discussion point. And basically, they have a situation where they have legacy teams that are really resistant to technical changes. Hey, we've always done it this way. They try to include them in the new solution. They're trying to onboard them. It's not one single technical problem. And that was kind of what we are going to talk about next, which is so how do you encourage the adoption of those new processes? How do you kind of onboard these people?
Ugh, yeah, that's well, usually there's a driver of sorts. So I would say things that I've seen was like, migration from Pivotal Cloud Foundry or out of on-prem data centers, things like that. So when there's some sort of mandate, so that is like, okay, now what do we do? Kind of thing, right? So then the question is sort of like how far forward do you, sort of pull people in one swoop? And what is the makeup of that team going to look like after, right? So if it's the same group of folks that are going to be building and maintaining the application, you have to be aware of that. You can't, if you look at, and again, we this is where we spend our time primarily, is helping folks with that move that with that modernization. The amount of cognitive load to take somebody who's been doing a very simple, kind of setup with six production servers and six beefy servers and a redundant database, and try to take them to cloud native with containers and Kubernetes and
Mhm.
CICD and CodeFresh and all of the things you put them through in that period, and expect to be able to have them walk away and own it in any short period of time is really going to be hard. So
Yeah.
usually there's a couple things. So one of the things would be kind of a technical mandate, and that we see pretty frequently. And so what we try to do is just be kind of mindful of how can we position them and move them forward to be, a crawl, walk, run sort of approach for their modernization. If they, for instance, have a very brownfield sort of application or offering in that the product suite for a company, not changing much, minor tweaks, etc. From a business perspective, probably doesn't make a lot of sense to make that
Yeah.
to do a lot there. The impetus is again generally technical. Then you rely on, is there anybody on that team that's super motivated to take on, you know, to what degree of modernization do they have an appetite? And then you also always have to point it back to there's a cost for that. Whether it's rewriting, re-architecting, the application, or just containerizing it, moving to a new platform. What's the business value? What what am I going to get? What am I going to see that's measurable as a business from that move, right? So if I'm going to get faster releases and shorter feedback loops, then okay, you better have an idea of what they are now, benchmark them, and be able to demonstrate that, and not have people wait years to see that. Again, the biggest thing you can that makes me run out the door is generally if it's a FOMO pitch, right? Oh, we're behind the rest of the world. You're still in business, so does it matter? Right. And I know that sounds terrible, right? From a guy who loves technology and really enjoys helping companies move forward, but that's the reality of it. There are organizations we run into where technology or app software, the delivery of software features really doesn't matter that much. It's mostly internal. It's, and they want to go with all the latest and greatest, DevOps, CICD, but they really don't, they can't sign that check because there's no way the business is going to get the value out of it. And at
Right.
best, it'll fizzle.
Yeah, and that makes total sense, right? And I think a lot of this comes down to weighing the appetite internally of making these big changes. And what parts of the company should be kind of peeled off to make these changes first, and how do we go about it? And a lot of it is just that internal buy-in that I think I would love to say that this is an engineering or a DevOps problem, but it really is a people problem when it gets to that point. And you need to find your people who are kind of your best cheerleaders on, and have the data to back it up. To Mark's point, right? Find out what that actual return is to the business, because that's what they're looking at to figure out whether or not we should make these efforts and do this work.
Yeah, and I think we're running low on our time here. Just I guess one thing that we didn't cover that I just want to put a little bit of just a quick statement out about is really the idea of it's not just application code. A lot of where I spend my time is infrastructure as code. Where what you're doing and building and releasing the CI/CD pipelines is your entire environment. And in those environments themselves being like, CAF landing zones, cloud adoption framework landing zones, allow innovation. They allow you to start to basically reduce the blast radius. There's so many of these things that go hand in hand. From one thing sort of helps the other. And so if I have an infrastructure that's sort of secure by default, secure by its design, it makes the business and the technology security people more likely to allow the modernization, to say, you know what, you guys can release 3 times a day, whatever. So there's some things like that go hand in hand. I just wanted to get that little plug in there from the CICD point of view. It's extremely, to get out of ClickOps, to get completely into DevOps and cloud native deployments of infrastructures, just as important, if not more important, in my opinion, than applications.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, we won't get time to cover it today, but I think we're going to have to do a follow-up session on the organization of DevOps and platform engineering teams, because I think we have a ton of
Well,
stuff to talk about
we
there
can
too.
definitely do a session on that.
Yeah,
For
we
sure.
could definitely do a session or two on that. So thank you so much for joining us today, Mark. We loved chatting with you. Is there anything that you want to plug for yourself or people tuning in right now? Anything you have ongoing up here?
Yeah. So one thing I'd like to, there's DevCon Midwest coming up on April 24th. It's actually going to be held up in Milwaukee in the Brookfield Conference Center, which is a great facility. If you haven't been there, real nice venue, easy to park, easy to get there off the interstates. That's more of the Midwest folks. The other one would just be if you're interested in following up with me at all, there is the just with LinkedIn, we do that. The other bit is to go to the Nvisia website and go under our cloud native digital foundations. I can send something to you, and you can actually go out there and set up a time. So I will pass that link, and you guys can, if I don't know how else you can get that out, but Brandon, I just shot that over
Yeah, absolutely.
to
I
you.
can just
At the bottom, there's like set up a thing. So we do like discovery sessions. We're not like here to, everything's different. If everything was the same, we'd say, yeah, here's the cookie cutter, use it. But just really benefiting from our experience. And we do have frameworks and things that we use to help jumpstart a lot of these initiatives, because a lot of it does take heavy lifting up front, and with horsepower, maybe you don't need to have around forever. Anyway, so we love working with people and helping them through this.
Well, yeah, that's great. And I mean, as someone who's worked with Mark before in that capacity, obviously they're hugely helpful. A lot of vision. They work with a lot of companies that are going through modernizations, but also on that deep technical edge as well. So really good experience. And then for myself and also Dan Garfield, so Emerging Domain, we actually have an episode coming up next month, which is how to set up a self-service GitOps. And it's really about the entire journey to self-service GitOps with Sergio Mendez. He's actually a CNCF ambassador. He's a DevOps leader at Yellow, so that'll be a lot of fun. I'll drop the link here. And then for Dan Garfield, always check out his Get Ops a Planet. I'm not quite sure what the next episode of that is. Dan, do you have the link to that? You can drop into the chat. But he's always doing some really awesome Get Ops related talks that we can tackle there. And then just stay tuned. We're doing a lot of really interesting stuff here. We have a lot of interesting conversations. And then look to the future for probably a future discussion with Mark again, where we tackle more of the organization side, the platform engineering side. And I'm not sure about you, Mark. I do have a couple of minutes that I can stick around for questions if we get any, but if not,
Yeah,
thank you
yeah, I can
so
stick
much
around.
for joining today.
Yeah, I can stick
Um,
around for a couple. At a point, I had a meeting that went away. It's the
oh,
most beautiful
perfect.
thing that's happened to me in quite a while. It's wonderful. I like it. Disappearing meetings.
Perfect. All right. Well, we'll just we'll throw on some music. We'll wait just a couple minutes for questions, and we'll see where we land.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Hopefully we'll have some exciting ones here.
Oh, interesting. So, how do you handle automated testing when breaking apart a monolith? In monolith tests may have been written that are end-to-end or validate dependencies. As it becomes distributed, how do you maintain the same level of confidence in automated testing? Well, that's a tricky one.
Well, yeah, there are test drivers that you should do that are external, right? So you can't do it from within the app.
Yeah.
So not all those processes are running within that application space anymore. So you really need drivers that can do end-to-end tests across the different pieces. That's not a, kind of Selenium grid and some things like that. I'm very hesitant to plug anything because I don't want to get anybody upset or think anything, but there are plenty of ways to do that. But again, I'm just going to point out those tests don't take care of themselves. Those frameworks, you need an owner for that, and that is an architecture unto itself. So you really want to have somebody that maintains that, and that's a part of your sprint cadence. So when you're coming out with new features, they're dealing with the stories, understanding kind of that more that end to end, so they can push the right buttons. And by the way, it might not just be UI kind of things. You may have API tests that hit an API that has 5 services behind it as well. So those things are all very important. I don't know, Brandon, if you have any other
I
thoughts.
do, and it's not good advice as far as automation goes, but it's good advice as far as comfort level, which is when you're in those early stages of breaking up those monoliths and going to microservices. In a perfect world, you would have automated tests end to end for that, and everything would be figured out. And to Mark's point, you'd have a bunch of tools that are doing this validation, and hopefully you're going to build some of that. But in my experience, it takes a little while for that stuff to come along and figure out what you really need to test. So I'm gonna say, for a little while, just to have that comfort factor, keep people as part of those releases and have them manually smoke test it. I mean, it sounds unfortunate. I would have someone smoke testing and looking at your API logs and, looking at your Kibana or whatever you have on the back end and doing some level of validation manually until you're more comfortable with the automation you have to back this stuff.
Yeah, and as an interim shim, I have sadly built out bash scripts inside of containers that I launch into the environment that actually go and hit endpoints.
Yeah.
So anything that you can do to start to instrument to understand what's happening, in a Brandon's point, that you have observability to a point where you can see if anything weird seems to be going on. Because it may work, but maybe it's performing terribly compared to a baseline. Those are just as important to find, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's all just about creating that comfort level and making sure that whatever you're doing is not going to scare, other people from doing the same process, right? Because your goal is to onboard people to get them to want to modernize stuff. If they're terrified because the results the last 3 deployments you've done have been awful, it's not going to sell itself. Um, so we are 8 minutes over, so I think we do have to close it out. But thank you so much to everyone for joining. Thank you again, Mark. You were an awesome guest, as I expected. And we'll catch up in the future, and we'll see you next month.
Very good. Thank you.